So you said that initially when you were forming the SMC and you were going to the heads of the newspapers and they were saying, oh, we don't need this. And now, fast forward almost 20 years, the journalists love it and they think it's an amazing resource. So how did that relationship change? Was it very sudden after you started reaching out to the journalists, after the SMC started, or has it been gradual?
It was not sudden. I think there were those moments, those examples I gave you with Dolly the sheep. Another one I remember was Tony Blair made his first ever science speech as Prime Minister. And that was a nice one because the science journalists were tipped off that the speech was 4:00. They were actually all invited. And I think it was in Oxford. So they all decided to go. But these were, it's only 20 years ago. It's hard to think, but we didn't have online media 20 years ago. So they were going to the speech in Oxford and then having to somehow get back to the office and write up their, 800,000 words for tomorrow's Telegraph, Times, Guardian, whatever. And so several of them actually approached us and said, is there any way that you could get the speech and get third-party costs? So Great and Good, I suppose, the head of the Wellcome Trust and some vice-chancellors, sciencey vice-chancellors to react to this science speech and get us those comments by the time we're sitting back at our desk. So it was gradual, but I do remember the reason that I remember these so clearly, so even though they were a long time ago, was they were good moments for us. Here were these journalists who'd said, I'm really sorry, but I don't think we'll need you, seeing a role for us. And we were able to do it. We were able to do what they wanted. And we then just became, I think, reliable. I think things like Fukushima were a real turning point, where the journalists were just so busy. And that's been the case with COVID. They were so busy. They were being asked, rather than doing 2 or 3 stories a day, they were being asked by their editors to cover every development in the Fukushima story, and the story was changing every few hours. And so having, in this kind of running commentary in their inbox of really good experts that they could copy and paste, or that they could ask us, can we speak to them directly, or they could get them for the 10 o'clock news that night. It just suddenly started to make their life easier. And I don't know how long it took. Again, this is something I say to we've got 2 new SMCs starting up now in Taiwan and in East Africa. And I try to remind them to not run before they can walk, and that, earning the trust of these journalists takes time. They also, if they're copying and pasting quotes, they have to know that it's not going to come back on them and somebody's going to say that quote was completely inaccurate, or that scientist that you quoted last week is a real maverick and outside of the mainstream. What are you thinking of? And I think over time, the fact that they were using what we were sending and never getting in trouble and not getting criticized, and that they started to really trust us. I'll tell you the other thing that made a massive difference, and it, again, really interesting in terms of our initial response. There were kind of elder statesmen of science journalists when I came. So like I say, there was Tim Radford, who was science editor at The Guardian, absolutely loved and feted. And, you somebody like me who just appeared on the scene couldn't go to him and say, right, let me help you do your job properly. I mean, he was helping me. He was giving me his contact. There was Roger Highfield, who was a science editor on the Daily Telegraph, who had a PhD, who'd written books about chemicals, who'd written books with Matt Ridley on genomics. I mean, there was Mark Henderson, who was the science editor of the Times, who's known as being really ambitious. And then something changed. And I don't really know what happened. There was some things were changing in newspapers, and they all left. A lot of them left. So Tim Radford actually retired. Mark Henderson left the Times and became director of communications at the Wellcome Trust. Roger Highfield left the Telegraph and became director of communications at the Science Museum. And we were bereft. There was another one, Charles Clover, who was environment editor at the Telegraph as well. He was brilliant. And he left to run a fishing charity. We were bereft. I just remember thinking, how is this going to work? Like, these journalists are so good. They care about science. And their replacements, we were being phoned up by the Telegraph saying, oh, there's this new chap who's taken over from Roger Highfield, and he was a general news reporter, and he did a bit of sports reporting, and you're like, oh God, this is awful. And now I feel really bad thinking about that, because a lot of those people, they knocked on our door straight away and said, oh, we gather that Roger was using you. Can we be added to all your lists? We went and met all of them. What we discovered was really, never let anyone say anybody who gets a job on a national newspaper or news outlet is clever, really clever. You don't get those jobs without being incredibly smart. So what we were seeing was these smart young journalists who had not a clue about science, who actually needed us even more. They needed us even more. So suddenly something that was a threat felt like an opportunity. And we were having very honest conversations with these people saying, you're a new journalist, but there are many pitfalls in science. You could get a lot wrong. Please work with us. And I would even say to them when I met them for an initial coffee, I'd say, how do you feel about me emailing you when you get things wrong? And it's very different to the kind of Ben Goldacre, let's write an article saying, journalists got stuff wrong, tweeting it everywhere, humiliating and embarrassing these journalists. What we were saying is we want to work with you. The Science Media Centre wants good coverage, but we're prepared to help you behind the scenes. And because they needed help and they were smart, they did that. And actually, there are a whole new breed of young, and many of them are still around today. People like Vicky Allen on the Mail, and they become really bloody good science journalists with no science background at all, no kind of decade of expertise. And now look, they're now covering COVID, and I think they're doing a really brilliant job. So, but they, I think, relied on us more than ever. So all of these services, when you ask about the gradual, I think these services were well thought out. They were based on, they weren't things we thought up over a glass of wine. They were things that we developed based on a need, clear need being articulated by the journalists. So we were meeting a need while promoting our mission. And if any startup ever comes to me, I've got some kind of tips for them about, make sure you don't start in a little room and say, this is what I fancy doing. Find out whether it will be used and it will make a difference.